August 4th, 2026. In Malheur County, Oregon, a fire that started in short grass 11 days earlier is moving across the high desert at the speed of the wind behind it. It has burned more than 500,000 acres. It is the largest fire burning in the United States, and it is still growing. Southwest of it, in the equatorial Pacific, the ocean is doing the one thing that is supposed to stop all of this. A strong El Niño is assembling, the biggest in a decade, accelerating faster than the models said it could. Every forecaster in the country knows what that means. It means rain. It means storms driving across the southern United States all winter. It means the drought breaks. And in the same week that ocean posts the largest jump it has recorded all year, the federal drought map moves the wrong way. Severe drought does not retreat across the country. It expands. That is not a contradiction, and it is not an error in either number. It is a map. The relief El Niño delivers is aimed at one half of this country, and the half that is currently on fire is not it. The worst drought disaster in American history was not started by a record-breaking ocean either. It was started by a weak one, landing on ground that was ready. This is the terrifying truth about the severe drought spreading across America. To understand how almost a third of a country ends up in severe drought, while the ocean that is supposed to rescue it is warming faster than it has in a decade, you have to go back to the winter before, to a season that arrived in the Pacific Northwest, looking like every other winter, and quietly failed to do the one job it had. Snowpack is not scenery. In the American West, it is infrastructure, a reservoir that builds itself for free between November and March, then releases slowly through the dry months, feeding rivers and irrigation canals and cattle troughs from May to September. A region can survive a dry summer. What it cannot survive is a summer that begins with an empty reservoir in the mountains. The winter of 2025 into 2026 was one of the warmest in Oregon's recorded history. The snow that fell came in wet and left early, and in many basins, it never really accumulated at all. And this was not a single bad year landing on healthy ground. It landed on multi-year precipitation deficits that had been stacking for seasons, each dry year drawing down soil moisture further, each spring starting lower than the one before. Drought is usually described as a shortage of rain, which makes it sound like something that arrives. It is better understood as a debt. Every dry season borrows against the water stored in the soil, in the aquifers, in the snow on the mountains. A place can carry that debt quietly for years, looking normal from the road, right up until the year the account comes up empty. By the time spring arrived, the ground across eastern Oregon, Washington, and Idaho was a loaded gun. It had simply not been fired yet. The declarations started in April. Oregon's Governor Tina Kotek issued the first drought declaration of 2026 for Baker, Umatilla, and Deschutes counties. And within weeks, an executive order had extended it to 6, adding Wallowa, Grant, Morrow, Crook, Jackson, and Jefferson. They kept coming. By the first week of July, 19 of Oregon's 36 counties were under a drought emergency, and as much as 86% of the state was in some form of drought. Washington and Idaho went further, declaring statewide drought emergencies covering every county in both states. What that looks like on the ground is less dramatic than a storm and harder to escape. On grazing allotments where the springs and creeks had gone dry, ranchers were hauling water to their own cattle by truck, not to irrigate anything, simply to give the animals something to drink. Regional reporting identified that single problem as one of the largest effects of the drought. Hay yields were coming in low, which meant feed costs were going up, which meant some ranchers were going to have to sell down herds they had spent decades building. In central Oregon, hundreds of farmers and ranchers were facing water cutoffs as the Deschutes River ran roughly a third below normal. In southern Oregon, growers were being paid to leave their fields empty, and water regulators were saying openly that some irrigators would be shut off before the growing season finished. None of this was a surprise to anyone living there, and all of it had one straightforward remedy. What the region needed was a wet winter, and out in the Pacific, something was building that looked exactly like one. Along a band of the equatorial Pacific that forecasters watch more closely than almost any other patch of water on the planet, the sea had begun to warm. The measurement is called the Oceanic Niño Index. It compares the temperature of that stretch of ocean against its long-term average, smoothed across 3 months, so a single hot week cannot masquerade as a trend. Cool values mean La Niña. Warm values mean El Niño. The sequence it produced across the first half of 2026 was not the shape these events usually make. The winter before, December through February, the index sat at minus 0.39 degrees Celsius, cool neutral, closer to La Niña than to anything else. By March through May, it had crossed to plus 0.46. By April through June, it was at plus 0.95, roughly double the previous reading. By May through June and July, it stood at plus 1.39. The ocean had swung about 1.8 degrees Celsius across 5 overlapping seasons, and the increments between those readings, plus 0.85, then plus 0.49, then plus 0.44, were not the profile of an event running out of energy. These things are supposed to slow as they mature through summer. This one had not. There is a reason almost nobody trusted it while it was happening. Every spring, ENSO forecasting passes through what meteorologists call the spring predictability barrier, a window from roughly March through May in which the models stop working, because tiny errors amplify into useless output. Through that spring, a great deal of expert commentary waved the developing signal away on exactly those grounds. The forecasters who called it correctly did so by refusing to look at the models at all. They watched the physical thing instead, the volume of anomalously warm water piling up below the surface in the western Pacific, and the westerly wind bursts, shoving it eastward along the equator. Models are guidance. Subsurface heat is a quantity you can measure. When the two disagreed through the barrier, the water won. Here is what a strong El Niño is supposed to do to the United States, and why every drought map in the West is read differently once one is confirmed. The warm water itself does not reach North America. What reaches it is a chain reaction. The temperature contrast running east to west across the equatorial Pacific drives a circulation of rising and sinking air across the tropics. Change that contrast, and the region of towering tropical thunderstorms slides thousands of miles east, pushing on the jet stream, the thing that decides where storms go and how long they stay. In a strong El Niño winter, the subtropical jet strengthens and drives across the southern United States. California gets storm after storm. The Gulf and the southeast turn wet. Reservoirs drawn down for years start climbing, and in the Sierra Nevada, the snowpack that failed the year before comes back in a single season. The guidance for the coming cool season pointed at exactly that. Every model held El Niño conditions through the entire forecast period, with the event projected to peak in October through December. And for that window, 23 of 26 models put the Central Pacific at or above plus 2 degrees Celsius, the threshold used for a very strong event. The Climate Prediction Center's alert status stood at El Niño advisory, with a 97% chance the event would still be running into early spring of 2027. And the atmosphere had already engaged, which is the condition that matters most, because an ocean can warm without the sky answering. So the ocean was delivering. The forecast was strong, confident, and pointed at rescue, which makes what happened in the first week of August difficult to look at. The United States Drought Monitor is published every Thursday, describing conditions as they stood at 8 in the morning the previous Tuesday. The map released on the 6th of August, describing the country as of the 4th, showed 48.54% of the contiguous United States in drought. 28.57% was in severe drought or worse. That second number is the one that matters, and the reason it matters is the direction it moved. Severe drought coverage did not shrink that week against the strengthening El Niño. It grew by 0.27 of a percentage point in the same 7 days that the index posted the largest jump it had recorded all year. A quarter of a point sounds like nothing. It is not, because the national figure is an average laid over a country pulling apart underneath it. The eastern United States improved that week, along with the Central Plains, the upper Midwest, and the interior West. Meanwhile, the Northwest kept deteriorating. The northern plains got worse again, and the southern plains began sliding for the first time. The number held still because the country was moving in 2 directions at once. And this is where the resolution sits, and it is not a comfortable one. El Niño's relief is not distributed evenly. It is aimed. The composite that soaks California and the Southwest and the Gulf is the same composite that runs dry and warm across the Pacific Northwest, the Northern Rockies, the Northern Plains, and much of the upper Midwest. Those regions are not neutral in a strong El Niño winter. They are on the losing side of it, which means the strongest El Niño assembling in a decade is arriving as rescue for a country whose worst hit region sits in the half of the map it makes drier. The relief is real. The forecast is sound. It is pointed at the wrong address. By the middle of August, that arithmetic has stopped being abstract because in eastern Oregon it is on fire. The Big Grass Fire is burning in Malheur County near the Idaho line. It was discovered on the 23rd of July, natural cause, and as of the federal listing on the 11th of August, it covers 553,000 acres. It is the largest single incident on the national list, with 1,286 personnel assigned under a complex incident management team. The fuel is the detail that explains everything else. It is shortgrass, roughly a foot high. Grass fires do not build the way timber fires build. They run. Under wind, across cured grass with no moisture left in it, a fire front moves at the speed of the wind behind it. In the most recent reporting period before that listing, big grass grew by about 13,000 acres, and its containment did not hold at the number it had reached. It fell back down to 35%. A fire that is growing while its containment percentage drops is a fire that is beating the people assigned to it in both directions at once. Oregon's largest wildfire on record is the Long Draw Fire of 2012, at roughly 557,000 acres. Big grass sits about 3,000 acres under that mark. It has covered 3,000 acres in an afternoon more than once during this incident, and it is not alone. The Crosswhite Fire has burned 342,681 acres. Coleman Creek has burned 308,721. Across the state line in Washington, the Little Giant Fire covers 116,956 acres at 2% contained, which at that size is not containment in any practical sense. In a single 24-hour window, satellite instruments detected 3,856 separate fire hotspots across the country. Oregon alone had burned past 2.3 million acres for the season. This is what a drought looks like when it stops being a number on a map. There is a reason to take a drought number seriously rather than wait it out, and it is not a hunch. It is the best documented catastrophe in the history of American land, and it began the same quiet way. In 1931, drought settled across the southern Great Plains, the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles, southwestern Kansas, southeastern Colorado, northeastern New Mexico. It did not lift. It held in overlapping waves for most of the decade. What made that region vulnerable was not the weather. For thousands of years, the southern plains had been held together by native shortgrass sod, a dense root mat that anchored a fine, high silica soil against the constant wind. Through the 1910s and 20s, driven by high wheat prices and new tractors, farmers broke that sod across millions of acres. The wheat grew. For a while it grew very well. Then the rain stopped and the wheat failed, and what was left was several million acres of loose, pulverized dirt with nothing holding it down and nothing but wind above it. The storm started in 1932 and got worse every year. In May of 1934, a single storm lifted soil off the plains and carried it east, far enough to dim the sky over Chicago, over New York, over Washington, and to drop plains dirt on the decks of ships several hundred miles out in the Atlantic. Farmers in Oklahoma were losing their fields to the sky, and the fields were landing on Manhattan. That was not the worst one. The worst one came the following spring, and it arrived on a beautiful day. The morning of Sunday, the 14th of April, 1935, is clear and warm and still. After weeks of blowing dirt, the air is clean. People across the panhandles go to church. They hang laundry. They open the windows. Children are sent outside to play for the first time in a long while. That morning, a dust storm begins in central Nebraska behind a fast-moving cold front and starts racing south. As it crosses the exposed ground of the plains, it picks up everything loose. What it builds is not a dust cloud. It is a wall, a rolling front of soil that witnesses and later National Weather Service accounts describe as rising 500 to 600 feet into the air, and in places higher, black at the base and brown-red at the crown, moving south across Kansas and into Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico. People see it coming from miles away and cannot process what they are looking at. Some think it is a rain cloud and feel relief. Some think the world is ending and say so afterward without embarrassment. Then it arrives and the day goes out. Not dims, goes out. Accounts from every affected town agree on the same detail. The transition from full afternoon daylight to absolute darkness takes minutes, and inside it, a person cannot see their own hand held in front of their face. Drivers stop where they are because the road is gone. Static electricity generated by the moving dirt shorts out car engines and knocks people down when they reach for a doorknob. Families in farmhouses press wet cloth over their children's faces and wait, in the dark, for a thing that has no sound to it but the wind. An Associated Press correspondent named Robert Geiger is traveling the region. He files his dispatch, and it runs in the Lubbock Evening Journal the following day. The opening line reads, "Residents of the southwestern Dust Bowl marked up another black duster today." He was describing a place. The phrase became the name of the decade, and it is the name we still use. The dust that fell over the southern plains was not ordinary dirt. It was pulverized to a fineness smaller than the period at the end of a printed sentence, and it carried a high silica content, and silica in a lung does not dissolve and does not leave. Breathed in over months, it produced a form of silicosis, clinically comparable to the black lung disease that was killing coal miners back east. They called it dust pneumonia. The people it killed most efficiently were the very young and the very old. The Red Cross declared a medical emergency in 1935 and opened 6 emergency hospitals across Colorado, Texas, and Kansas. Some were set up in school gymnasiums that had to be sealed against the dust before patients could be brought inside. Hospitals that had to be made airtight against the weather in order to treat people the weather had already injured. They handed out 10,000 gauze masks to school children. The masks plugged solid with dirt in about an hour. 10 days after Black Sunday, Red Cross officials in Kansas alone reported 17 deaths from dust pneumonia and 3 more from dust suffocation. Across the era, the commonly cited death toll from dust pneumonia runs to roughly 7,000 people, a figure that accumulated one household at a time over years, in a way that never produced a single day anyone could point to. Roughly 2.5 million people left the Plain States during the 1930s. It remains one of the largest internal migrations in American history, and most of the people in it were not fleeing a storm. They were leaving ground that no longer produced anything, carrying whatever fit in the car. 5 days after Black Sunday, on Friday the 19th of April, 1935, a soil scientist named Hugh Hammond Bennett walked into room 333 of a United States Senate office building to testify before a congressional subcommittee on public lands and surveys. Bennett had been making the same argument for years to anyone who would sit for it. American topsoil was being destroyed. The destruction was permanent on any human timescale, and only the federal government was large enough to stop it. He had been right for a decade, and Congress had spent that decade not acting. He walked in that morning knowing something the committee did not. He had been tracking a large dust storm moving east off the plains, and he had a rough idea of when it would reach the Capitol. So he stalled. He drew out his answers. He belabored points he had already made. He kept those senators in that room while the light coming through the windows shifted from ordinary spring daylight to a strange copper color, and then kept going as the copper deepened and then went out. When the room had gone dark in the middle of the afternoon, Bennett gestured toward the window and said the line that ended the argument. "This, gentlemen, is what I've been talking about." 8 days later, on the 27th of April, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Soil Conservation Act. It created the Soil Conservation Service, and Bennett was put in charge of it. What followed was contour plowing and terracing and crop rotation and cover cropping, and the Shelter Belt program that put more than 200 million trees into the ground across the plains to break the wind. And it worked. When droughts of comparable meteorological severity returned in the 1950s, the soil largely stayed where it was. The lesson had been learned, and it had been paid for. Here is the part that reaches forward, and it comes from the science rather than the storytelling. In March of 2004, a NASA-led team published a study in the journal Science titled "On the Cause of the 1930s Dust Bowl." They had reproduced the entire decade-long drought in a climate model using nothing but sea surface temperatures. A cooler than normal tropical Pacific paired with a warmer than normal tropical Atlantic, held across the years 1931 to 1939. The worst environmental catastrophe in American history was manufactured by the ocean, thousands of miles from the ground it destroyed. The southern plains never got a vote, but the model did not reproduce it exactly. The real Dust Bowl was more severe than the ocean alone could account for, and centered in the wrong place. In 2009, a second team published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and found the missing piece. You have to add the land, add the stripped ground and the dust it was throwing into the air, and the simulated drought deepens and shifts and matches what actually happened. The ocean started it, the ground finished it. And there is one more detail in that first study worth sitting with. The tropical Pacific anomalies that drove the 1930s were described by the authors as surprisingly weak. The worst drought disaster in the history of the United States was not launched by a record-breaking ocean. It was launched by a modest one, landing on ground that had been made ready for it. None of that means 2026 is 1935. It is not, and the differences are real. The soil practices Bennett fought for are still in place and still working, and the forecast for the southern tier is good. A wet California, a wet southeast, heavy snow in the Sierra. The honest weaknesses cut both ways, and they belong in the record. The western Pacific near Australia is not as cool this time as it was in 1997, and it is the contrast across the basin, not the raw temperature, that does the work. So a record number may not deliver record consequences. And the last strong El Niño, in 2015 and 16, failed to verify in the Pacific Northwest at all. That winter came in wet, against every composite expectation. What the 1930s actually argue is narrower and harder to dismiss. The ocean sets the odds, the ground decides the outcome, and the ground is where the leverage has always been. The reason the southern plains became farmland again was not only conservation practice. It was the Ogallala Aquifer and the irrigation that reached it. Water banked over thousands of years spent to make a semi-arid region productive. That account is being drawn down. The engineering solution to the last one was, in part, a withdrawal. So when 28.57% of the country is in severe drought, and that figure grows during the steepest ocean warming of the year, while the largest fire in the nation gains ground and loses containment in the same week, the useful response is not to wait for the rain the forecast promises. It is to notice which half of the map the rain is aimed at, and to remember that the last time this country lost a region, the ocean signal behind it was described as weak. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. These documentaries take a lot of research and a lot of hours to put together, and if you got something out of it, a like, a comment, or a subscribe genuinely helps more than you would think. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.